Good morning, students. Today we are going to complete chapter first, the last lesson. Let us start from the paragraph after the grammar. We had a lesson in writing which you find on page number 7. In previous class it was the grammar, and on that day everyone was very attentive as it was last lecture of M. Hamel in French language, because from the next day German to be taught in the schools of Alsace and Lorraine. Now let us see what next to be going to happen in this lesson. After the grammar, we had a lesson in writing. That day M. Hamel had new copies for us, written in a beautiful round hand, France Alsace, France Alsace. They looked like little flags floating everywhere in the schoolroom, hung from the rod at the top of our desk. You ought to have seen how everyone set to work and how quiet it was. The only sound was the scratching of the pens over the paper. After grammar, they had a lesson in writing. M. Hamel was having new notebooks for them on that day. In that notebooks, France Alsace was written very beautifully. French felt that there was an air of patriotism in the class, and the notebooks were like flags of France that were floating all around. On that day, the entire class was busy writing the task given by their teacher. There was pin drop silence, and only the sound that could be heard was the scratching of the pens on the paper. It seemed that they were very attentive and wanted to complete the task sincerely. Here, their patriotic feelings arose and were looking very sad, as they were never been so serious regarding their language. I think it is clear. Let us see the next part. Once some beetles flew in, but nobody paid any attention to them, not even the littlest ones, who worked right on tracing their fishhooks as if that was French. Too, on the roof the pigeons cooed very low, and I thought to myself, will they make them sing in German, even the pigeons? Now let us see. Once some beetles flew into the class, but no one panicked, as everyone was quite in their writings. There were some pigeons sitting on the roof of the class and scratching the roof with their claws. It seemed that they were also students busy writing the task of French language. In the class, the coo sound of the pigeons could be heard. Hearing the sound of the pigeons, French wondered and thought whether the Prussian soldiers or the Prussians were also able to force the pigeons to change their language and coo in German. In these lines, the narrator wants to say that language comes naturally to a being, and it cannot be forced upon anyone, be it the peasants or the Frenchman. Now let us see the next paragraph. Whenever I looked up from my writing, I saw M. Hamel sitting motionless in his chair and gazing first at one thing, then at another, as if he wanted to fix in his mind just how everything looked in that little schoolroom. Fancy, for 40 years he had been there in the same place, with his garden outside the window and his class in front of him, just like that. Now let us see this paragraph. In between writing, French looked at M. Hamel. He saw his teacher was staring at the different things in the classroom, and it seemed that he just wanted to memorize the appearance of everything before leaving the school. M. Hamel had been teaching in that school for the last 40 years, and it was painful for him to leave the place. So he just wanted to fix everything of the school before leaving in his mind. He was deeply attached with the school. Okay, I think up to here it is clear. Now let us see the next part. Only the desk and benches had been worn smooth, the walnut trees in the garden were taller, and the hope vine that he had planted himself twined about the windows to the roof. How it must have broken his heart to leave it all, poor man, to hear his sister moving about in the room above, packing their trunks, for they must leave the country next day. Let us say up to here. As I told you that M. Hamel taught in that school for the last 40 years, and with the passage of time nothing changed, and only changes were that the desk in the classroom had worn out due to use over the years, the walnut trees in the garden outside had grown taller, the hope vine on the outer wall of the school building had climbed up to the roof. Only these changes were there and nothing else. Further, Franz, who was glancing sometimes while writing, felt that for his teacher it would be painful and he must be heartbroken to be sent away from a place where he had spent 40 years of his life. Further, the noises of M. Hamel's sister packing and moving their luggage could be heard from the room upstairs. It seemed that they had to leave the school next day. Okay, now see the next paragraph. But he had the courage to hear every lesson to the very last. After the writing, we had a lesson in history, and then the babies chanted their ba, be, bo, boo. Down there at the back of the room, old Hauser had put on his spectacles and holding his primer in both hands, spelled the letters with them. Let us see up to here. As I told you, M. Hamel was not only a strict teacher, but also he was very honest to his profession. He just wanted to complete his class on that day. So he heard the lesson from the entire class. When the writing task was over, there was a lesson of history followed by phonetics, where they recited the sounds of alphabets. Here, French referred to the class as babies because although they were grown up, still they were reciting the lessons of phonetics, which is usually done by younger children, and so he calls himself and his class to be babies. I told you earlier that the villagers were also there in the class. Among them there was a Hauser, and at that time he had put on his spectacles and holding the primer in both his hands and reciting the letters with the class. At that time he was crying and his voice trembled as he spoke. It was only because they were not going to get any more lesson on French by their teacher M. Hamel. Okay, now see the next lines. You could see that he too was crying. His voice trembled with emotion, and it was so funny to hear him that we all wanted to laugh and cry. Ah, how well I remember it, that last lesson. Let us see up to here. Hauser was crying, and when Franz saw Hauser crying, he had mixed feelings, as he found it funny to see how an old man like Hauser was crying and trembling, and on the other hand, he also felt emotional just like Hauser. He could not forget this last lesson. It was the last lesson as it was given by M. Hamel in French language. Okay, now let us see the next part. All at once the church clock struck 12, then the Angelus. Angelus here means prayer song. At the same moment, the trumpets of the Prussians returning from drill sounded under our windows. Hamel stood up, very pale in his chair. I never saw him look so tall. Okay, now let us see up to here. Just then, the clock at the church struck 12 and the prayer song began. And at the same moment, the sound of the trumpets played by the Prussian soldiers, they returning from the drill. Hamel stood up. His face became dull and colored, as the time had come for the class to get over. He was looking grave and motionless. For a French, he had never appeared to be so tall. Okay, now see the next part. My friends, said he, but something choked him. He could not go on. Then he turned to the blackboard, took a piece of chalk, and bearing on with all his might, he wrote as large as he could, Vive la France. Okay, now see what we are finding here. MML was so upset that he wanted to speak but could not continue, as he was overpowered by his emotions. Without saying anything, he took a piece of chalk and wrote the words Vive la France, which means Long live France, on the blackboard as large as he could write. Okay, now see the last part. Then he stopped and leaned his head against the wall, and without a word, he made a gesture to us with his hand. School is dismissed, you may go. After writing on blackboard, he bent towards the wall, and without speaking anything, he signaled the class to leave the class, as the class was over and the students may go home. That is all about this chapter, the last lesson. It is clear to all of you. Okay, thank you.